My name is Sawyer Holcomb, demolition expert for FEMA. 3 days ago, a government broadcast turned my hometown into a hunting ground for the infected. They hunt by sound. One wrong move means death. I survived the first 48 hours of this silent, zombie outbreak because of my headphones and my knowledge of how buildings break. This is my warning to you. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story. There. Let's begin. I never thought I'd be making a video like this. My name is Sawyer Holcomb. Everyone calls me Scrap. I was a structural demolition specialist with FEMA's Urban Search and Rescue Division. My job was to assess compromised buildings after disasters and bring them down safely if needed. I'm recording this because information is survival now. If you're watching this, you need to know what happened in those first hours. You need to know what's out there and how they behave. Maybe you can avoid my mistakes. 3 days ago, I was in Millridge, Tennessee, small town, about 15,000 people. I was there with my team to demo the old Parkson Mill. It was one of those ancient brick factories built back in the 20s that had been sitting abandoned for decades. The city council finally got the funding to tear it down and replace it with a community center. Pretty standard job. My crew was small, just 4 of us. Me, Rodriguez, who handled explosives, Tanner, who managed logistics, and Deacon, who was our safety officer. We'd been on site for 2 days already, mapping the structure, planning charge placement, and calculating how to bring the building down without damaging the historic courthouse across the street. That morning started normal. We met at the motel for breakfast, went over the day's inspection schedule. I remember joking with Rodriguez about the coffee being so bad it was a structural hazard itself. We got to the mill around 8:30. Standard procedure for me is to wear noise-canceling headphones during initial inspections. Years of explosive demolition work has made me paranoid about my hearing. The guys give me grief about it, but I don't take chances. We split up to cover different sections of the mill. I was in the east wing checking support columns when it happened. 9:42 in the morning. I remember checking my watch when all our phones went off simultaneously. You know that emergency alert sound, right? The one they test occasionally? This was different. Through my headphones, I could barely hear it, but I saw the alert on my phone screen. National Emergency Broadcast System Test. This is not a drill. Then came this tone. High-pitched, strange, almost musical, but not quite. It lasted exactly 5 seconds, then nothing. The cell service cut out immediately afterward. My first thought was North Korea had finally pulled the trigger on those missile tests. But there were no explosions, no sirens, just silence. I tried the radio, but there was nothing but static. I called out to my team over our walkies. Rodriguez answered first, sounding confused. "Scrap, you hear that broadcast? My head is killing me." Tanner chimed in next, also complaining of a sudden headache. Only Deacon didn't respond. I found them all in the main floor area. Rodriguez was sitting against a wall, pressing his palms against his temples. Tanner was pacing, wincing with each step. Deacon was just staring blankly at his phone. His nose was bleeding, and he didn't seem to notice. "Let's call it a day," I told them. "Something's not right." Rodriguez didn't argue, which was unusual for him. Normally he'd push to stay, keep working, but he just nodded and slowly got to his feet. I remember thinking he looked pale. I offered to drive them back to the motel, but they insisted they were fine to take their own vehicles. That decision probably saved my life. I watched them leave, then spent another 30 minutes securing the site. Standard procedure. Never leave a demo site unsecured, even for a day. That's the kind of habit that keeps you alive in my line of work. Turns out it would keep me alive for what was coming too. By the time I headed back into town, things had already started to change. Traffic was stopped at the main intersection. Not just backed up, stopped completely. Drivers were standing outside their cars, arguing. Someone had rear-ended a pickup truck, and the driver was screaming at the other guy, but in a strange way. His words were slurred, and he kept grabbing his head like he was in pain. I pulled into the Gas and Go to fill up my truck and get some aspirin for the guys. The place was packed, but eerily quiet. People were gathered around the TV behind the counter where the emergency broadcast symbol was still showing. No information, just the symbol. The cashier, a kid named Tyler who couldn't have been more than 20, was arguing with an older man in a business suit. "I can't process your card." "Sir, the machines are down," Tyler kept saying, but the businessman wasn't listening. He was sweating profusely and his eyes looked unfocused. "Just run it again," the man insisted, swaying slightly. "I need my coffee. I need to get to my meeting." I grabbed a bottle of aspirin and some water bottles and put a 20 on the counter. "Keep the change," I told Tyler. "Machines down everywhere?" "Yes, sir, Mr. Holcomb, internet too. My manager went to call corporate, but he hasn't come back." Tyler looked nervous. People are acting weird. As if on cue, the businessman suddenly doubled over, clutching his stomach. When he straightened, blood was trickling from his ears. "Just run the card," he repeated, but his voice had changed. It was flat, emotionless. I backed away slowly. "Tyler, I think you should lock up and go home." "I can't just leave the store," he said. The businessman suddenly lunged across the counter, grabbing Tyler's shirt. "Run the card," he shouted, and that's when I noticed his eyes. The whites had gone cloudy like cataracts but spreading across the entire eye. I reacted without thinking, grabbing the coffee pot and smashing it against the man's head. He went down hard, coffee and blood mixing on the floor. Tyler was shaking, staring at the man. "What's wrong with him?" Tyler whispered. "I don't know, but you need to get out of here. Go home, lock your doors, call the police if you can." I wasn't sure if the police could do anything, but it seemed like the right thing to say. As I headed back to my truck, I saw more people behaving strangely. A woman was repeatedly walking into a lamppost, bouncing off it and trying again. A mail carrier was sitting in his truck, banging his head rhythmically against the steering wheel. And everyone who wasn't acting bizarre was clutching their heads, complaining of migraines. I tried calling my team. No answer from any of them. So I drove to the motel. Rodriguez's truck was there, parked at an angle across 2 spaces. The door to his room was open. I called his name as I approached, one hand on the knife I keep in my belt. Construction sites can be dangerous places and old habits die hard. The room was trashed, furniture overturned, bathroom door hanging off its hinges, blood on the walls, not a lot, but enough to worry me. No sign of Rodriguez. His phone was on the floor, screen cracked, but still showing that emergency broadcast symbol. I checked Tanner's room next. Door locked, no answer to my knocking. Deacon's room was empty, bed still made. I went to the front office, but no one was there either. That's when I heard the screaming from the diner across the street. Full-on terror screams. I ran over without thinking. Inside, a waitress was backed against the counter while a man in a trucker cap advanced on her. His movements were wrong, jerky, mechanical. Blood was streaming from his nose and ears, and his eyes had that same cloudy look as the businessman. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to distract him. He spun toward me with unnatural speed, and the sound that came out of his mouth wasn't human. It was like a distorted recording played at the wrong speed. The waitress took the opportunity to run past him, but the movement caught his attention. He lunged at her, teeth bared. I grabbed a chair and swung it at him, connecting with his shoulder. He stumbled but didn't fall, didn't even seem to register the pain. Instead, he turned back to me with that same inhuman sound, this time louder. And that's when I noticed something critical. The sound he made caused another person at the far end of the diner to look up, an elderly man who had been sitting motionless in a booth. The old man's eyes were clouded too, and at the sound he stood up and started moving toward us with the same jerky gait. They were responding to sound. I backed toward the door, keeping the chair between me and the trucker. The waitress was already outside, running down the street. I followed, but not before I saw 3 more people with clouded eyes emerging from the kitchen area, all moving in the direction of the noise. Back in my truck, I tried the radio again. Nothing but static, except for one station broadcasting, an automated message. "Stay indoors, await further instructions." Over and over. I needed supplies if things were going south. The hardware store was 2 blocks away. I drove there carefully, avoiding the people wandering in the streets. Some looked normal but dazed. Others had that clouded eye look and moved with that distinctive jerky motion. The hardware store was unlocked, but empty. I grabbed what I could: rope, duct tape, a first aid kit, flashlights, batteries. As I was checking out the tool section for anything useful, I heard a noise from the back room. A shuffling sound, then a thud. "Hello?" I called out immediately, regretting it. The storage door burst open and the store manager stumbled out. I recognized him. Mr. Gaines had to be 70 years old. His eyes were completely white now, and his movements were so spasmodic it looked like he was being puppeteered by someone who didn't know how joints worked. He let out that same distorted sound I'd heard from the trucker. I backed away silently, realizing my mistake in calling out. He paused, head tilting like he was listening. When I didn't make another sound, he seemed confused, moving aimlessly around the counter. Testing a theory, I carefully set down my supplies and picked up a wrench. I tossed it across the store where it clattered loudly against a metal shelf. Mr. Gaines immediately snapped toward the sound and charged in that direction, colliding with shelves and sending items crashing down. The noise only attracted him more, sending him into a frenzy of movement as he attacked the shelf where the wrench had landed. I used the distraction to gather my supplies in a canvas bag and slip out the front door. Back in my truck, I sat there, processing what I'd seen. People getting sick after the broadcast, the headaches, the bleeding, the transformation, the hypersensitivity to sound. And I realized why I might have been spared. My noise-canceling headphones had protected me from whatever signal had been embedded in that broadcast tone. I needed to find others who might have been protected. The library, I thought. If anyone wore earplugs or headphones regularly, it might be the librarians dealing with noisy patrons all day. As I started the engine, I caught movement in my rear-view mirror. Mr. Gaines had followed the sound of my door closing. He was shambling toward my truck, mouth open in that silent scream. Behind him, more figures with clouded eyes were emerging from nearby buildings, all drawn to the noise. I pulled away as quietly as the truck would allow, watching in the mirror as they congregated where I'd been parked, heads twisting as they searched for the source of the sound. They reminded me of buildings about to collapse, unstable, dangerous, and impossible to predict. And just like with Demolition, I realized that understanding how they worked was going to be the key to surviving what was coming. I made it to the hardware store without incident, which felt like winning the lottery at that point. I'd thrown everything I could think of into my cart: rope, duct tape, a crowbar, batteries, flashlights, a portable camping stove, water purification tablets. Anything that might be useful if things continued deteriorating. The rational part of my brain was still trying to convince me this was a temporary situation, maybe a gas leak or some kind of mass hysteria. But 20 years of disaster response work had taught me to prepare for the worst. The streets were getting worse by the minute. More people with that clouded eye look were appearing. They moved differently than the others now, more coordinated but still wrong somehow. And they all responded to sound in the same way, aggressively and immediately. As I loaded supplies into my truck, I heard a crash from the clothing store. Across the street, the front window shattered as someone was thrown through it. A man tumbled onto the sidewalk amid broken glass, scrambling backward as one of the infected lunged after him. The infected was making those horrible, distorted sounds, and within seconds 3 more appeared from around the corner, drawn by the noise. The man saw me and started shouting for help. I froze for a split second, calculating. Every instinct told me to help, but I could see more infected turning toward us, attracted by his shouts. There were at least a dozen now, all moving with that jerky speed toward the sound of his voice. "Stop shouting," I called to him, keeping my voice as low as possible. "They're attracted to noise." He either didn't hear me or was too panicked to process what I was saying. He kept screaming as he backed toward my truck. The infected were closing in fast. I made a split-second decision. I reached into my bag and pulled out a road flare I'd grabbed from the hardware store. I struck it and hurled it through the broken window of the clothing store. The bright light and hissing noise immediately drew the attention of the infected. They turned as one and charged into the store. "Get in!" I told the man, opening my passenger door. He didn't need to be told twice. We pulled away as quietly as possible, watching the infected pour into the store behind us. "What the hell is happening?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Those people, they just snapped. My wife was fine 1 minute, then her eyes went all white and she tried to kill me." "I think it was the broadcast," I said, keeping my eyes on the road and my speed steady. "That emergency alert this morning, did you hear it?" "Yeah, everyone did, gave me a headache." "But you didn't change." I glanced at him. "Why not?" He shrugged, still trembling. "I don't know. Maybe because I'm partially deaf? Industrial accident a few years back." He touched his ear. "I wear hearing aids, but I had them turned down when the alert came through. Thought it was just another test." That confirmed my theory. Protection from the sound was protection from whatever had changed these people. I introduced myself and learned his name was Marcus, a mechanic at the local garage. "Where are we going?" he asked. "The library," I told him. "If we're right about sound being the vector, we might find others who were protected there. Librarians, people with headphones." We drove in silence for a few blocks. The streets were emptier now, with most people either transformed or hiding. Occasionally we'd see someone running, usually being pursued by the infected. I wanted to stop and help, but Marcus grabbed my arm each time. "You can't save everyone," he said, "and if those things catch us, we're dead." He was right, but it didn't make it any easier to watch. The library was an old stone building near the center of town. As we approached, it looked undamaged, which was a good sign. I parked a block away, not wanting the sound of the engine to attract attention. "We go quietly," I whispered to Marcus. "No sudden movements, no loud noises. If we see any of them, we freeze or move in the opposite direction. Got it?" He nodded, his face pale but determined. We made our way to the library, staying close to buildings and watching for movement. Twice we had to stop and press ourselves against walls as infected stumbled past, their heads swiveling as they searched for sounds. Up close, they were even more disturbing. Their skin had a grayish tinge, and small blood vessels had burst around their eyes and noses. Some had blood crusted around their ears. All had that same cloudy whiteness covering their eyes. The library doors were locked, but there was light visible inside. I tapped gently on the glass, just enough to be heard by someone close by, but hopefully not enough to attract the infected. After a moment, a face appeared at the window, an elderly woman with thick glasses. She studied us carefully, then disappeared. A few seconds later, there was the sound of a lock turning and the door opened just enough for us to slip inside. "Quickly," the woman whispered, locking the door behind us. "They're attracted to sound." "We know," I said. "I'm Sawyer. This is Marcus." "Ruth Pemberton," she replied. "Head librarian for 37 years. Follow me." She led us through the main reading room, which was dark and empty, to a door marked "Staff Only." Beyond it was a staircase leading down to the basement. As we descended, I heard voices, actual human voices having a conversation. The sound was so normal it almost brought tears to my eyes. The basement had been converted into a makeshift shelter. There were about 15 people there, sitting on cushions and chairs dragged from upstairs. Battery-powered lanterns provided light. I recognized a few faces: the high school music teacher, a couple of teenagers who always had earbuds in, an old man who I knew wore hearing aids. "More survivors," Ruth announced quietly. "They know about the sound sensitivity." A middle-aged man stepped forward. He was wearing a security guard uniform with the logo of the local bank. "Jim Holloway," he introduced himself. "We've been gathering people here since this morning. You're the first new arrivals in about 2 hours. What do you know about what's happening?" I asked. Jim gestured to a woman sitting nearby with a laptop. "Sarah's been monitoring amateur radio. Not much information, but what we've pieced together isn't good. The broadcast affected people nationwide, maybe globally. Those who heard it clearly either died from cerebral hemorrhages or transformed into what you've seen outside. The people, who survived either had hearing protection, were deaf or hard of hearing, or were in soundproofed rooms. Sarah added, "We're calling them echoes because of the way they seem to echo sounds back to each other." "Like echolocation?" Marcus asked. "Something like that," Sarah nodded. "They use sounds to communicate and coordinate, and they're getting better at it." That was a disturbing thought. I explained who I was and what I'd seen around town. Then I asked the question that had been nagging at me since the hardware store. "Have any of you seen someone transform after the initial broadcast? Is this thing contagious?" The room went quiet. Finally, Ruth spoke up. "We had one. A young man who came in about an hour after the broadcast. He seemed fine, just confused, like the rest of us. But then he started complaining about hearing a ringing sound, like the broadcast was still playing in his head. Shortly after that, his nose started bleeding. We didn't know what to do. By the time we realized something was seriously wrong, his eyes had already started to cloud over." "What happened?" Marcus asked. Ruth looked down. "Jim had to handle it. The young man became violent, just like the others outside." Jim nodded grimly. "We locked him in the supply closet. He's still in there, but he stopped making noise about an hour ago. I processed this information. So whatever this is, it might have a delayed onset in some people." "Did the young man have any hearing protection during the broadcast?" "He said he was wearing earbuds listening to music," Sarah replied. "But they were just the regular kind, not noise canceling." That made sense. Partial protection might have slowed the process but not prevented it entirely. I shared my theory about my noise-canceling headphones providing complete protection. "So what's the plan?" Marcus asked. "We can't stay here forever." Jim pointed to a map spread out on a table. "We've been marking infected activity based on what people saw before arriving here. They seem to be concentrating in areas with the most noise. The high school where the fire alarm got triggered, the hospital with all its equipment, the shopping center." I studied the map. They're not just random. They're organizing around sound sources. It reminded me of how structural stress concentrates at certain points in a building. In Demolition, we target those stress points. Has anyone tried to reach the outside? Police, military? "Phone lines are down, cell service too," Sarah said. "But on the radio, we picked up some chatter about a military perimeter being established outside town. Problem is, we'd have to get past thousands of those things to reach it. And we'd have to do it silently," Ruth added. I looked around the room at the survivors. Most looked exhausted and terrified. There were a few children, clinging to parents, an older couple holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. These people needed more than just a safe hiding place. They needed hope. "I think I might be able to help," I said. "My job involves understanding how structures respond to stress and sound. If these infected are drawn to noise, we can use that. Create distractions, safe paths. Like demolition in reverse," Jim suggested. "Exactly," I nodded. "Instead of bringing things down, we're creating a way out." We spent the next hour planning. Sarah had a detailed town map, and I marked potential routes and sound shadow areas, places where buildings would block sound propagation. Marcus, with his mechanical knowledge, suggested ways we could create timed noise distractions. As we worked, Ruth kept watch at a small window that looked out at street level. Suddenly she gasped. "They're gathering," she whispered. We rushed to the window. Outside, at least 30 infected were congregating in front of the library. They weren't making noise or trying to get in. They were just standing there, heads tilted as if listening. "Do they know we're here?" Marcus whispered. "I don't think so," I replied. "There's no way they could hear us through these walls." As we watched, one of the infected made that distorted sound, and the others responded with similar noises. Then, as if receiving instructions, they spread out, taking positions around the building. "They're coordinating," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Like they're setting up a perimeter. Or hunting," Jim added grimly. That's when we heard it, a loud thump from upstairs, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Someone or something had broken into the library. "The rear, fire exit," Ruth whispered. "Someone must have left it unlocked." Jim unholstered a pistol I hadn't noticed before. "I'll check it out." "Not alone," I said, grabbing my crowbar from my pack. "Marcus, stay here with the others. If we're not back in 5 minutes, assume the worst and use the storm drain access." We marked on the map. We crept up the stairs, moving as silently as possible. The main floor of the library was still dark, but now shafts of late afternoon sunlight streamed through broken windows. Books lay scattered across the floor where shelves had been overturned. A noise came from the children's section, a soft scraping sound. Jim raised his gun and I tightened my grip on the crowbar. We moved forward cautiously, staying low behind the circulation desk. The children's area was a mess. Colorful chairs, overturned picture books strewn everywhere. At first I didn't see anything. Then a small movement caught my eye. A book sliding off a shelf as something bumped against it from the other side. Jim signaled that he would go left while I went right, flanking whatever was there. I nodded and we split up, circling the shelves, from opposite directions. I reached the end of my shelf and peered around. There, crouched on the floor surrounded by fallen books, was a young woman. She was huddled in on herself, shaking. Her hair was matted with blood, but her eyes were clear, no cloudy whiteness. "Hey," I whispered as gently as possible. "We're not going to hurt you." She looked up, startled, then relaxed slightly when she saw I was normal. "They're right behind me," she whispered back. I thought I could make it to the police station, but they were everywhere. I barely made it in here. Jim appeared from the other direction. "We need to get back downstairs. Now." Those things outside definitely heard the window breaking. As if to confirm his words, there was a loud crash as something heavy hit the library's front doors. Then another. The infected were trying to break in. "Can you walk?" I asked the woman. She nodded. "Good. Follow us and stay absolutely silent." We hurried back toward the basement door, the sounds of the infected assaulting the building growing louder behind us. We were halfway there when the front doors gave way with a splintering crash. Instantly, the distorted sounds of multiple infected filled the space. "Run!" Jim hissed, no longer bothering with silence. We sprinted for the basement door. Jim reached it first, yanking it open. The young woman went through, then me. Jim followed, pulling the door shut behind him just as the first infected appeared at the end of the hallway. We thundered down the stairs to where the others waited, faces pale with fear. "They're in," Jim announced. "We need to move, now." "What about the storm drain?" Marcus asked. "No time," I replied. "They'll be through that door in seconds, and these basement windows are too small for most of us." Ruth pointed to a heavy metal door at the back of the room. "The boiler room connects to the old coal delivery tunnel. It leads to the courthouse across the street." "Perfect," I said. "Everyone grab only what you absolutely need. We move in 30 seconds. As the group scrambled to collect essential items, I pulled Jim aside. "We need to slow them down, buy the others time." He nodded grimly, understanding what I was suggesting. "The library's old. Lots of flammable material upstairs. I've got road flares in my pack," I said. "If we set a controlled burn at the top of the stairs, it might hold them back long enough." It was a dangerous plan. The fire could spread, trapping us as effectively as the infected. But we were out of options. Jim and I headed back up the stairs while the others prepared to evacuate through the boiler room. At the top of the stairs, we could hear the infected searching the library, knocking over shelves and desks as they hunted for the source of the sounds they'd heard. I handed Jim a flare. "On 3, I whispered. 1, 2, 3. We struck the flares simultaneously and tossed them into piles of books and papers we'd quickly gathered at the top of the stairs. The material caught immediately, flames spreading, faster than I'd anticipated. The heat and light drew the infected like moths. They came around the corner just as the fire reached a bookshelf, which went up with a whoosh. Several infected charged straight into the flames, seemingly oblivious to the danger. They caught fire but kept coming, their distorted sounds taking on an even more horrific quality. "Go!" Jim shouted, shoving me toward the stairs. We raced back down, the sounds of burning infected following us. At the bottom, Jim slammed the door shut, and I wedged a metal shelf against it. "That won't hold them long," I said. "Let's move." The others had already opened the boiler room door. Beyond it, I could see the ancient coal chute that Ruth had mentioned. It was narrow and dark, but it was our only chance. One by one, our group of survivors entered the tunnel. I went last, pulling the boiler room door shut behind me. The tunnel was tight and smelled of damp earth and rust. We moved as quickly as we dared in the darkness, the sounds of the infected breaking through the basement door spurring us on. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, we reached the end of the tunnel. A rusted metal door blocked our path. Jim and I pushed against it with all our strength, feeling it give slightly. "Together," I grunted. 1, 2, 3. We slammed our shoulders into it simultaneously. The door broke free with a screech of metal that seemed deafening in the confined space. We emerged into what appeared to be a maintenance room in the courthouse basement. As the last of our group filed through, I heard something that made my blood run cold, the sound of infected in the tunnel behind us. They'd followed us through. "Keep moving," I urged the group. "Find the stairs up." We hurried through the courthouse basement, eventually finding a stairwell that led to the main floor. The grand old building was eerily silent. Through the windows, I could see the library across the street was now fully engulfed in flames. The fire would attract every infected for blocks. "We need a defensible position," Jim said. "Somewhere up high with limited access." I thought for a moment, then remembered the building's layout from my demolition planning. The clock tower. It has a single staircase and thick walls. Sound won't carry in or out easily. Without a better option, our weary group made for the clock tower stairs. As we climbed, I heard the unmistakable sounds of infected entering the building below. The library fire had drawn many of them, but not all, and those distorted sounds they made seemed to be calling more of them to the courthouse. We reached the clock tower just as the first infected appeared, at the bottom of the spiral staircase. Jim and Marcus slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and I helped them push a massive oak desk in front of it. In the fading light of early evening, our group of survivors looked at each other with the shared realization that while we had escaped immediate danger, we were now effectively trapped. Below us, more infected gathered, drawn by the sounds of our ascent. Their distorted calls echoed through the courthouse, each one seeming to attract more of their kind. I moved to the tower window and looked out over Millridge. Fires had broken out in several locations. The hospital was partially collapsed. The high school's football field was filled with infected, all standing eerily still as if waiting for something. In the distance, I could see flashing lights at the town perimeter. Military or police, I couldn't tell. So close, yet impossibly far, given what stood between us and them. The young woman we'd rescued sat huddled in a corner, still trembling. I approached her carefully. "I'm Sawyer," I said. "What's your name?" "Ellie," she replied. "I was at the community college when the broadcast happened. I had noise-canceling headphones on while studying in the library. Another one saved by hearing protection. It confirmed my theory, but didn't offer much comfort now that we were trapped." "You're safe with us," I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We're going to figure this out." Jim joined us, his expression grim. "The door will hold for now, but we need a plan. Food and water are limited, and those things don't seem to need either." I nodded, trying to think like a demolition expert. In my work, every problem had a solution. Every building, no matter how solid, had weak points. These infected this situation. There had to be a vulnerability we could exploit. "They're drawn to sound," I said slowly, an idea forming. "And they seem to be getting more coordinated, more intelligent in how they hunt. But that might be their weakness too." "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked. I looked up at the massive clock mechanism above us, its gears silent for now. "I'm thinking we need to change the rules of the game. They hunt by sound. Let's give them more sound than they can handle." That first night in the clock tower was the longest of my life. Our group huddled together in the cramped space, listening to the infected below. The heavy wooden door separating us from them creaked occasionally as they pushed against it, testing for weakness. The desk we had shoved against it held firm, but I knew it was just a temporary solution. I went over to Jim, who was keeping watch at one of the narrow windows. "How many do you think are out there now?" I asked in a whisper. "Hundreds," he replied grimly. "Maybe more. They keep coming, drawn by the library fire, and they're not leaving even though the fire's dying down." He was right. From our elevated position, we could see infected converging on the courthouse, from all directions. They moved with that distinctive, jerky gait, but there was something different now, something more coordinated about their movements. They weren't just wandering aimlessly anymore. They were establishing a perimeter. "They're learning," I said, voicing the fear we all shared. Jim nodded. "And we're running out of time. Food and water won't last more than a day or two, even with rationing." I turned back to the group. Ruth was comforting Ellie, who still seemed shell-shocked. Marcus was examining the clock mechanism with professional interest. The others were either sleeping or staring vacantly into space, trying to process how their world had collapsed in less than a day. "We need to start thinking about a way out," I said quietly. "Through all of them?" Jim gestured toward the window. "Impossible. Nothing's impossible," I countered. "Just differently challenging. In Demolition, when a building doesn't come down the way you expect, you don't give up. You reassess and find a new weak point." Before Jim could respond, a metallic grinding sound came from above us. Everyone froze, eyes darting upward to the clock mechanism. Marcus had backed away from it, hands raised to show he hadn't touched anything. "It's automated," Ruth whispered. "The courthouse clock, it chimes every hour." Horror washed over me as I realized what was about to happen. A clock chime would draw every infected within miles directly to us. I scrambled up the short ladder to the clock mechanism, frantically looking for a way to disable it. The ancient gears were already turning, preparing for the hour strike. "Help me," I hissed to Marcus. "We need to stop this now." He climbed up beside me, and together we examined the mechanism. It was an old pendulum system with weights and counterweights controlling the movement. "The hammer," Marcus said, pointing to the component that would strike the bell. "If we can disconnect it or jam it somehow." I pulled out my multi-tool and tried to wedge it between the gears, but the metal was too thick. The mechanism continued its inexorable countdown. Below us, the infected had gone completely silent, as if they too were listening for the chime. With seconds to spare, Marcus yanked off his belt and looped it around the striking hammer, pulling it back and away from the bell. The mechanism completed its cycle, but instead of a resonant chime, there was only a muffled thunk as the hammer strained against the leather belt. We held our breath, listening. The silence from below continued for a long moment, then gradually the sounds of the infected resumed their irregular pattern. They hadn't heard. "Quick thinking," I told Marcus as we carefully secured the belt to make sure the hammer couldn't reach the bell. "Just postponing the inevitable," he replied grimly. "That belt won't hold forever." He was right again. We needed a more permanent solution, both for the clock and for our escape. I returned to the group and explained what had happened. "So they really are drawn to sound," Ellie said, speaking up for the first time since we'd arrived in the tower. "Not just any sound, though. They seem most attracted to sudden, loud noises." "Like a dinner bell," Jim added. That gave me an idea. What if we use that? Create a distraction loud enough to draw them away from the courthouse. "To what end?" Ruth asked. "Even if we draw them away temporarily, we still have to get past them to reach the military perimeter." "One problem at a time," I said. "First, let's secure this position and disable the clock permanently." Sarah, who had been mostly quiet since the library, suddenly spoke up. "The radio," she said. "I almost forgot. In all the chaos, I grabbed the emergency radio." She pulled a small hand-crank radio from her bag. "Maybe we can get some information about what's happening outside Millridge." We gathered around as she carefully turned the volume to its lowest setting and began scanning frequencies. Most were static, but eventually we found a clear signal. It was an automated emergency broadcast. This is the emergency alert system. A national emergency has been declared. Multiple population centers are experiencing severe civil disturbance following the emergency broadcast system test. Citizens are advised to remain indoors. Avoid making loud noises. If you encounter affected individuals, do not attempt to communicate with them. Quarantine zones are being established around major urban centers. Further instructions will follow. The message repeated, giving us no new information. Sarah continued scanning and eventually picked up what sounded like a military frequency. Perimeter secure at checkpoint Bravo, requesting additional support at grid reference 47 Alpha. Large concentration of hostiles moving south along Highway 16. No civilian evacuations until sunrise. Repeat, hold all civilian evacuations until sunrise. Sarah turned off the radio. At least we know they're out there, she said, and they're evacuating civilians. If we can reach them, Marcus added. I moved back to the window, studying the town layout. The military perimeter seemed to be established along the southern edge of town, maybe 2 miles from our position. Under normal circumstances, an easy walk. But with thousands of infected between us and freedom, it might as well have been 100 miles, unless we could use their sensitivity to sound against them. I spent the next hour examining the clock mechanism more carefully, formulating a plan. The clock was powered by a system of weights and counterweights, with enough stored energy to keep it running for days between windings. If we could redirect that energy, we might be able to create a series of timed noises to draw the infected away from our escape route. I explained my thinking to the group. The infected are drawn to sound, right? So we create a series of controlled sounds like a trail of breadcrumbs leading away from the path we want to take. Using what? Jim asked. I pointed to the clock mechanism. This thing has enough stored energy to make plenty of noise. We just need to redirect it. Marcus, with your mechanical knowledge, can you help me modify this to create timed strikes that will activate after we leave? He examined the mechanism thoughtfully. Maybe. If we reconfigure the escape wheel and alter the pendulum timing, we could create irregular strikes. But once it starts making noise, every infected in town will converge here. Exactly, I said. While they're focused on the courthouse, we slip out through the back and make our way to the military perimeter. It's risky, Jim warned. If the timing is off, or if they don't respond the way we expect, we could end up trapped between groups of them. Every option is risky now, I countered. But I'd rather take a calculated risk than slowly starve up here. The group debated the plan, but ultimately everyone agreed it was our best chance. We spent the rest of the night preparing. Marcus and I worked on modifying the clock mechanism, while the others inventoried our supplies and prepared for the journey. By dawn, we had transformed the clock into what I can only describe as a mechanical noise generator. We disconnected the regular timing mechanism and replaced it with a series of improvised triggers that would activate at irregular intervals once we released the pendulum. Each trigger would cause the hammer to strike the bell, creating a sound loud enough to be heard throughout town. How long will it keep making noise? Ruth asked as we finished our work. Hard to say, Marcus replied. Given the stored energy in the weights, maybe 6 to 8 hours. After that, it'll need rewinding. By then we should be long gone, I said with more confidence than I felt. We gathered our few supplies and prepared to move. The plan was simple. Release the modified clock mechanism, which would remain silent for 15 minutes before the first strike. During that time, we would make our way down the tower stairs through the courthouse and out the back entrance. Then we'd follow a route I'd mapped out using my knowledge of the town structure, staying in what I called sound shadows, where buildings would help block any noise we made. If all went well, the first bell strike would draw most of the infected toward the courthouse while we were already a quarter mile away. Subsequent strikes would keep them focused there as we made our way to the military perimeter. Jim checked his pistol one last time. 6 rounds, he said quietly. Last resort, only. I nodded, tightening the straps on my pack. Everyone ready? They nodded, faces tense but determined. I moved to the clock mechanism and released the pendulum. It began swinging silently, counting down the minutes until the first strike. "Let's move," I whispered. We opened the tower door cautiously. The stairwell was clear, but we could hear infected moving on the floors below. We descended as quietly as possible, each footstep measured and careful. The spiral staircase led to the main courthouse floor, a grand open space with marble columns and wooden benches. Through the windows I could see infected milling around, outside still surrounding the building but seemingly less focused than before. We crept through the courthouse, staying low and using the benches for cover. Twice we had to freeze in place as infected wandered across our path, their clouded, eyes sweeping back and forth as they listened for sounds. Each time they moved on, apparently satisfied that nothing was there. The back entrance was a small service door used by maintenance staff. It opened onto an alley behind the courthouse, which according to my mental map would be less populated, with infected. Jim reached it first, testing the handle. It was unlocked. He eased it open just enough to peer outside. "Clear for now," he whispered, "but there's a group of them at the end of the alley, maybe 30 yards away." I checked my watch. 10 minutes had passed since we'd activated the clock mechanism. We had about 5 minutes before the first strike. "We need to be well away from here when that bell rings," I said. "Ready?" Everyone nodded. One by one, we slipped through the door into the alley. The morning air was cool and damp, with a haze of smoke from the library fire still hanging over the town. We moved quickly but silently, hugging the wall of the courthouse. At the end of the alley, we paused. Just as Jim had said, a small group of infected were gathered at the intersection with the main street. They were standing unnaturally still, heads tilted as if listening. To reach the next phase of our route, we needed to cross the street without being detected. I motioned for the group to wait, then carefully removed a small mirror from my pack. I used it to check around the corner without exposing myself. The main street was clearer than I'd expected, with only scattered infected visible in either direction. Our timing would need to be perfect. I was about to signal the group to move, when one of the infected at the intersection suddenly made that horrible distorted sound. The others responded in kind, creating a cacophony of unnatural noises. Then, as if receiving instructions, they began to spread out, taking positions along the street. "They're setting up a perimeter," Jim whispered, "like they know we're coming." A chill ran down my spine. How could they know? Were they actually communicating information to each other through those sounds? Before I could consider the implications, the courthouse bell rang out, loud and clear in the morning air. Every infected within view immediately snapped to attention, then began moving toward the sound with that jerky, unnatural speed. "Now," I said, not bothering to whisper anymore. While they're distracted, we broke cover and raced across the street, reaching the alley opposite just as hundreds of infected converged on the courthouse behind us. The bell rang again, then again, the irregular pattern we'd programmed drawing them into a frenzy. "It's working," Marcus said, breathing hard. "They're completely focused on the courthouse." "For now," I cautioned. "Keep moving. We need to reach Sycamore Street before the next pattern starts." We continued through the back alleys of Millridge, moving as quickly as we dared while still trying to minimize noise. The route I'd chosen kept us away from main streets and open areas where infected might still be roaming. Instead, we used service corridors between buildings, climbing through windows when necessary, always staying in the shadow zones where sound wouldn't travel as easily. About 20 minutes into our journey, the courthouse bell began its second programmed sequence, a rapid series of strikes that sounded almost like an alarm. In the distance, we could see infected streaming toward the courthouse from all directions, emptying out areas that had been heavily populated. "The gas station on Elm should be clear now," I told the group. "We can cut through there to reach the highway faster." We changed course slightly, emerging from an alley onto Elm Street. The gas station stood abandoned, pumps silent, windows shattered. But as we approached, I noticed something that made me signal the group to stop. A single infected was wandering around the gas station, moving differently than the others we'd seen. It was sniffing the air, head swiveling in quick, precise movements, rather than the jerky motions we'd observed before. When the courthouse bell rang again, it paused but didn't immediately run toward the sound. "It's not responding like the others," Ellie whispered. "They're adapting," I realized. Some of them are ignoring the bell now, maybe focusing on other senses. As if to confirm my theory, the infected suddenly turned in our direction. It couldn't have heard us from that distance, and its clouded eyes couldn't possibly see us clearly. But something had alerted it to our presence. "Back," I hissed, pulling the group into the shadow of a building. "We need another route." We backtracked, finding a narrow passage between two storefronts. It would take us the long way around, adding precious minutes to our journey, but it was better than confronting the infected at the gas station. The detour forced us closer to the residential areas of town, which I'd been hoping to avoid. Houses meant more potential for infected to be hiding inside, waiting to burst out at any sound. But we had no choice. As we crept through a backyard, I noticed something disturbing. The infected were starting to return from the courthouse direction, moving more purposefully now. The bell was still ringing, but they seemed to have lost interest in it. Our diversion was failing faster than I'd anticipated. "They're learning to ignore artificial sounds," I whispered to Jim. "We need to move faster." We picked up the pace, taking more risks with noise than before. At one point, Marcus stepped on a garden hose, knocking over a metal watering can. The clatter seemed deafening in the morning quiet. We froze, waiting for infected to appear, but none came. "Something's wrong," Ruth said. "They should have heard that." I nodded, a new worry forming. They're not coming because they're converging somewhere else. They found a sound more interesting than our bell. "Or they're setting a trap," Jim added grimly. We resumed our journey with renewed urgency, cutting through yards and climbing fences when necessary. As we approached the southern edge of town, we began to see signs of military presence, abandoned checkpoints, armored vehicles, some with their doors hanging open. "The perimeter must have pulled back," Jim observed. The courthouse bell had stopped ringing now, either because the mechanism had failed or because the infected had somehow disabled it. The silence was almost more unnerving than the constant chiming had been. We reached Jefferson Avenue, the last main street we needed to cross before hitting the highway. Beyond it, maybe half a mile away, we could see the military barricades that marked the new perimeter. So close, yet the most dangerous part of our journey still lay ahead. Jefferson was wide and exposed, with little cover. Worse, I could see infected moving along it in both directions, more coordinated than ever. They were patrolling, that was the only word for it. Moving in small groups, scanning their surroundings, communicating with those distorted sounds. "They've established a defensive line," Jim said, voicing what we all realized. "They're cutting off access to the highway." We huddled in the shadow of a small office building, watching the infected movements, trying to identify a pattern or weakness. The immediate problem was clear. To reach the military perimeter, we'd need to cross Jefferson Avenue, then make our way across an open area to the barricades. With the infected patrolling the avenue, a direct crossing seemed impossible. "What about the storm drains?" Marcus suggested. "If we can get below the street, we might be able to bypass them entirely." It was a good idea, but I remembered the town infrastructure from my demolition planning. The drains don't connect to this side of town. The system was planned for an expansion that never happened. "Then we need another distraction," Jim said. "Something bigger than the bell." I looked around, my demolition expert's mind cataloging potential resources. The office building we were hiding behind had a small generator out back. The gas station we'd avoided earlier had fuel. Combine those with the right trigger and we could create an explosion large enough to draw every infected for blocks. "I might have an idea," I said slowly. "But it's going to be loud. Very loud." I explained my idea to the group. The office building's generator could be wired to overload, creating a significant explosion if we added fuel from the gas station. It would be dangerous, but it would create the diversion we needed to cross Jefferson Avenue and reach the military perimeter. "I'll need to get to that gas station," I said. "Get enough fuel to make this work." That infected is still there, Ellie reminded me. The one that wasn't responding to the bell. I'll handle it, Jim said, checking his pistol. But we need to be smart about this. One shot will bring every infected in the area down on us. Marcus spoke up. What if we split up? Jim and Sawyer go for the fuel while the rest of us prepare here. We can set up a fallback position in case things go wrong. I didn't like the idea of splitting our group, but time was running out. The infected were becoming more organized by the hour, and our window of opportunity was closing. All right, I agreed. But if anything goes wrong, don't wait for us. Make for the military line as soon as you hear the explosion. Ruth, who had been watching the infected movements on Jefferson, turned to me. They're establishing patterns. Every 12 minutes or so, there's a gap in their patrol. If we time the explosion right, we could cross during the confusion. Her observation impressed me. Good eye, I said. We'll sync our watches and aim for that window. Jim and I gathered what we needed from our packs. I took my multi-tool and some electrical tape, while Jim kept his pistol ready but hidden. The others would stay hidden behind the office building, preparing the generator for our return. Ready? I asked Jim. He nodded grimly. We moved out, backtracking through the residential area toward Elm Street. The gas station was about 3 blocks away, but we'd need to cross several open areas to reach it. We stuck to the shadows, freezing, in place whenever infected passed nearby. At one point, we had to press ourselves into a doorway as a group of 3 infected moved down the street. They were communicating with those distorted sounds, but there was something different about it now. The sound seemed more structured, almost like a language. When one made a particular noise, the others would change direction or speed up. They were definitely coordinating. Once they passed, we continued toward the gas station. When we reached the edge of Elm Street, I could see the lone infected still wandering around the pumps. It was moving with that same strange awareness we'd noticed before, sniffing the air and turning its head in quick, precise movements. I've never seen them behave like that, Jim whispered. It's almost like it's hunting. I nodded, a chill running down my spine. We need to take it out silently, no gunshots. Jim pointed to a hardware store across the street. There might be something useful in there, a weapon that won't make noise. We made our way to the store, keeping low and moving only when the infected's back was turned. The front door was shattered, glass crunching under our feet as we entered. Jim immediately moved to the tool section while I checked for other infected inside the store. The place was clear but showed signs of a struggle. Blood spatters on the wall, overturned shelves. Whatever had happened here hadn't ended well for the people involved. Jim returned with a heavy framing hammer. Not ideal, but it'll do the job if I can get close enough. We watched the infected through the store window, trying to identify a pattern to its movements. It seemed to be circling the gas station, pausing occasionally to make those strange noises as if reporting to others further away. I'll approach from behind while it's facing the street, Jim said. You stay here as backup. If something goes wrong, get the fuel and get back to the others. Don't wait for me. I didn't like the plan, but I couldn't think of a better alternative. Jim slipped out the back of the hardware store while I moved to the front entrance, ready to create a distraction if needed. Jim circled around, approaching the gas station, from behind a row of abandoned cars. The infected continued its patrol, unaware of his presence. He crept closer, hammer raised. 20 feet, 10 feet, 5. Just as Jim was about to strike, the infected suddenly stiffened and made a loud, distorted sound I hadn't heard before. It spun around with unnatural speed, cloudy eyes somehow fixing directly on Jim. Before he could swing the hammer, it lunged forward. Jim swung defensively, connecting with the infected's shoulder. It staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it grabbed for Jim, fingers clawing at his jacket. They grappled, Jim trying to break free while keeping the infected from making more noise. I had to act. I grabbed a wrench from a nearby shelf and sprinted across the street. The infected had Jim pinned against a car now, its mouth open in that silent scream. Jim was using the hammer handle to keep it at bay, but he was losing ground. I swung the wrench with all my strength, connecting with the back of the infected's head. It dropped immediately, releasing Jim. I hit it twice more to make sure it wouldn't get up, each impact making a sickening crack that seemed too loud in the morning quiet. "You okay?" I asked Jim, scanning the street for more infected drawn by the noise. He nodded, breathing hard. "Thanks. That was too close." He examined a tear in his jacket sleeve. "Didn't break the skin. I'm good." We moved quickly to the gas station pumps. As I'd feared, they weren't working without electricity. "We need to get to the underground tanks," I said. "There should be an access point somewhere." We found it behind the station, a metal cover, set into the concrete. Jim helped me lift it, revealing the top of the tank with its filling ports. I pulled out a length of rubber hose I'd grabbed from the hardware store. "Old school siphoning," I explained, feeding the hose into the tank. "Used to do this as a teenager when we ran out of gas on back roads." After a few attempts, I got the siphon started, filling the plastic containers we'd brought. We needed enough fuel to create a substantial explosion, but not so much that we'd risk setting half the town on fire. "Got it," I said, securing the caps on our containers. "Let's get back to the others." We made our way back through the residential streets, moving faster now that we had what we needed. The containers of gasoline sloshed dangerously as we ran, but there was no help for it. Time was running out. When we reached the office building, the others had already prepared the generator, exposing its wiring and creating a small platform where we could place the fuel containers. Marcus had rigged a simple timer using a wristwatch and some wire from the building's electrical panel. "Good work," I said, examining the setup. "This should create enough noise and fire to draw them away from Jefferson." Ruth was still watching the infected patrols. "Their gap is coming up in about 4 minutes. We need to be ready to move as soon as the explosion happens." I placed the fuel containers carefully around the generator, making sure the blast would be directed away from our escape route. Then I connected the timer, setting it for 3 minutes. "Once I start this, there's no stopping it," I warned the group. "Be ready to run the moment it blows. Don't look back, don't stop for anything, head straight for the military perimeter." Everyone nodded, faces tense but determined. I looked at them. Ruth with her librarian's cardigan now torn and dirty. Marcus with oil stains on his hands from working on the generator. Ellie still pale but standing straighter now. Jim with his torn jacket and determined expression. Sarah, clutching her radio like a lifeline, and the others whose names I hadn't even had time to learn. Strangers 24 hours ago, now bound together by survival. "Ready?" I asked. They nodded again. I activated the timer and we all moved back to our hiding spot at the corner of the building. 3 minutes that felt like an eternity. 2 minutes. 1. The explosion was bigger than I'd anticipated. The generator erupted in a fireball that shot 30 feet into the air, the concussion wave hitting us even at our sheltered position. The roar was deafening, and immediately followed by smaller explosions as other flammable materials caught fire. "Now!" I shouted, not bothering with silence anymore. We broke cover and ran toward Jefferson Avenue, the infected already streaming, toward the explosion behind us. The avenue was clearing rapidly, the patrol patterns broken as they responded to the much more interesting sound and light of the fireball. We crossed Jefferson at a sprint, not slowing until we reached the cover of an abandoned construction site on the other side. From there we could see the military barricade about a quarter-mile ahead, concrete barriers, armored vehicles, and soldiers with weapons ready. "We made it," Marcus gasped, relief evident in his voice. "Not yet," Jim cautioned. "They're still open, ground between us and them, and the infected will realize the explosion wasn't prey soon enough." He was right. Already some of the infected were returning to their patrol routes, apparently having determined that the explosion wasn't worth investigating further. Their learning ability was terrifying. "One final push," I said. "We stay together, move fast, and make straight for the barricade. The soldiers will see us coming and provide cover if needed." We moved through the construction site, using stacks of materials and equipment for cover. As we neared the edge, the open ground between us and the military perimeter looked impossibly exposed. 200 yards of nothing but scrub grass and debris. "I'll go first," Jim said, Draw their attention if there are any infected out there. We stay together, I insisted. If we get separated now, some of us won't make it. Just as we were about to break cover, a new sound reached us. The whump 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 of helicopter rotors. A military helicopter appeared over the barricade, hovering low. A soldier with a loudspeaker was saying something, but we were too far away to make out the words. "They've seen us," Ellie said hopefully. The helicopter began moving in our direction, keeping low. As it approached, I could finally make out what the soldier was saying. "Survivors, remain in cover. Do not attempt to approach the barricade. Repeat, do not approach the barricade." Confusion and fear spread through our group. "Why are they telling us to stay back?" Ruth asked. "We're so close." The helicopter hovered directly overhead now, the downwash whipping debris around us. The soldier with the loudspeaker continued. "A retrieval team is being dispatched to your location. Remain in cover. The open area is not safe." Jim pointed toward the grassy expanse between us and the barricade. "Look." At first I didn't see anything. Then I noticed movement in the grass. Infected, dozens of them lying flat on the ground. They had been hiding, waiting for survivors to attempt the crossing. "They set a trap," I whispered, the realization chilling me to the bone. They knew we'd try to reach the barricade. The helicopter maintained its position above us, effectively pinning us in place with its noise. The infected in the grass remained, still apparently weighing the helicopter's sound against the potential prey hiding at the construction site. "What now?" Marcus asked. "We can't stay here and we can't cross." Before I could answer, a new sound reached us, the growl of heavy engines. From the military barricade, 2 armored personnel carriers were approaching, their mounted weapons scanning the grassy area. "The retrieval team," Sarah said. "They're coming for us." The vehicles moved methodically, occasionally firing short bursts into the grass where infected were hiding. Each burst would trigger a frenzy of movement as infected either charged the vehicles or fled from the noise. The armored carriers were clearing a path yard by yard. "They'll reach us soon," Jim said. "We just need to hold position." But the helicopter's presence was becoming a problem. Its constant noise was drawing more infected toward our position from the town behind us. I could see them emerging from buildings along Jefferson Avenue, moving with purpose toward the construction site. "We're about to be pinned between 2 groups," I warned, the ones behind us and the ones in the grass. The lead armored carrier was about 100 yards away now, its progress slowing as it dealt with more infected. The second vehicle was providing covering fire, keeping the area around them clear. "We need to help them reach us," I decided. "If we stay here, we'll be overrun before they arrive." I looked around the construction site, my demolition expert's mind cataloging resources again. There were bags of concrete mix, lengths of rebar, stacks of lumber. Nothing immediately useful. Then I spotted it, a small bulldozer parked near the site office. If it had fuel, it could provide both transportation and protection. "Marcus, come with me," I said, pointing to the bulldozer. "The rest of you stay hidden but be ready to move the moment we call." Marcus and I made our way to the bulldozer, keeping low. It was an older model, nothing fancy, but its cabin was enclosed and its blade would provide a barrier between us and the infected. "You know how to hotwire these things?" I asked Marcus. He grinned for the first time since we'd met. Part of my misspent youth. While he worked on the ignition, I checked the fuel gauge. Half full, more than enough for what we needed. The helicopter continued circling overhead, its noise holding the infected at bay but also drawing more of them toward us. "Got it," Marcus said as the engine rumbled to life. "Now what?" "We're going to clear a path for the others," I explained. "Drive toward the armored carriers. Use the blade to push infected out of the way." He nodded, shifting the bulldozer into gear. We moved to where the others were hiding. "When we pull up, get on top of the dozer," I instructed them. "Hold on to the cabin and don't fall off. We're going to meet the soldiers halfway." The plan was risky, but sitting and waiting was no longer an option. The infected from town were getting closer, and the ones in the grass were growing agitated with the continued noise from the helicopter and armored carriers. Marcus positioned the bulldozer with its blade facing the open ground. "Ready?" he asked, hand on the throttle. "Ready," I confirmed. "Full speed, don't stop for anything." He gunned the engine and we lurched forward, breaking cover and heading into the open ground. Immediately, infected rose from the grass, charging toward the noise. The bulldozer's blade caught the first wave, pushing them aside as we continued forward. "Now," I shouted to the others. They broke from cover, running alongside the slow-moving bulldozer until they could climb onto its sides and back. Jim helped Ruth up, then Ellie. Sarah passed up her radio before climbing on herself. The armored carriers had spotted us and were increasing their speed, firing more frequently to clear infected from our path. The helicopter swooped lower, using its downwash to knock infected off balance before they could reach the bulldozer. We were moving at maybe 15 miles per hour, pushing through grass and debris. Every few seconds, an infected would try to climb the blade, only to be dislodged as Marcus swerved slightly. Those that made it past the blade would try to reach the cabin, but Jim and I kicked them away before they could get a grip. The distance between us and the armored carriers was closing rapidly. 50 yards, 40, 30. I could see soldiers leaning out of the top hatches providing additional covering fire. Then disaster struck. The bulldozer hit something hidden in the grass, maybe a drainage ditch or debris pile. The front end dipped suddenly, throwing several of our group forward. Ruth lost her grip and fell onto the blade. Before we could react, she slid off the side, landing directly in the path of oncoming infected. Jim didn't hesitate. He jumped down after her, pistol drawn. "Keep going," he shouted to us. "Get them to the carriers." Marcus tried to turn the bulldozer to provide them cover, but more infected were swarming around us now, making maneuvering nearly impossible. I watched in horror as Jim helped Ruth to her feet, then stood protectively in front of her as infected closed in from all sides. The armored carriers were only 20 yards away now. So close. The lead vehicle suddenly accelerated, pushing past the bulldozer toward Jim and Ruth. Soldiers leaned out, firing precisely at the infected closest to them. "Keep going," I told Marcus. "Get to the second carrier. I'll help Jim and Ruth." Jumped down from the bulldozer, landing hard on the ground. The grass was tall enough that I momentarily lost sight of Jim and Ruth, but I could hear gunfire and those distorted sounds the infected made when attacking. I ran toward the sound, pushing through grass and dodging infected, distracted by the larger target of the armored carrier. When I reached Jim and Ruth, soldiers were already pulling them aboard the vehicle. Jim was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but both were alive. "Scrap," Jim called when he saw me. "Get on." I started toward the carrier, but something hit me from behind with incredible force. I fell forward, rolling instinctively to avoid whatever had attacked me. An infected with clouded eyes was already lunging for me again, moving faster than any I'd seen before. I scrambled backward, searching for a weapon. My hand closed around a piece of rebar half buried in the dirt. As the infected pounced, I swung the metal rod with all my strength, connecting with its head. It fell to the side, but immediately started to get up again. More infected were converging on my position now, drawn by the movement and noise. The armored carrier was backing up, trying to reach me, but it wouldn't arrive in time. I was surrounded. Then I heard the bulldozer's engine roar. Marcus had turned around and was charging back, the blade clearing a path straight to me. The others were still clinging to the top, firing weapons the soldiers must have given them. "Sawyer," Ellie shouted, "run toward us." I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted toward the bulldozer, infected closing in from both sides. The blade caught the ones in front of me, pushing them aside. I reached the side of the machine and hands grabbed me, pulling me up. "Got you," Marcus said, grinning despite the chaos. "Couldn't leave our demolition expert behind." The bulldozer turned, again heading for the armored carriers, which were now positioned side by side, forming a corridor of safety. Soldiers provided covering fire as we approached, taking down infected with precise shots. We reached the vehicles and scrambled aboard, abandoning the bulldozer. Strong hands pulled us into the armored interior. The hatches slammed shut, cutting off the sounds of the infected outside. Inside the carrier, a soldier was already treating Jim's head wound. Ruth sat beside him, shaken, but unharmed. The others were crowded onto benches along the walls, relief and exhaustion evident on their faces. "Everyone accounted for?" a soldier asked, his voice professional but kind. I did a quick head count. All 15 of us had made it. Against all odds, we'd survived. "We're all here," I confirmed. "Good job," the soldier said. "I'm Sergeant Miller. We're taking you to the secure zone at Camp Harding, about 10 miles south of here." As the vehicles began moving, I leaned back against the cool metal wall, finally allowing myself to feel the exhaustion of the past 36 hours. We'd made it. We'd escaped Millridge and its silent hunters. But as the adrenaline faded, questions began to replace relief. What had happened to the rest of the country? Was this outbreak everywhere? And most disturbing of all, how were the infected evolving so quickly, developing tactics and communication that seemed almost intelligent? I looked around at the weary survivors who had become my responsibility, then at the soldiers who had risked their lives to save us. Whatever answers awaited us at Camp Harding, I knew one thing for certain. The world had changed irrevocably in less than 48 hours, and surviving the initial outbreak was just the beginning of our struggle. The ride to Camp Harding was eerily quiet. After the constant tension of the past 2 days, the armored carrier's interior felt almost unnaturally safe. The rhythmic vibration of the engine and the occasional radio chatter from the soldiers were the only sounds. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts, processing what we'd been through and what might lie ahead. I used the time to observe my fellow survivors more carefully. Marcus was examining his hands, which were covered in small cuts and burns from hot wiring the bulldozer. Ellie had finally relaxed enough to fall asleep, her head resting against the carrier's wall. Ruth was whispering something to Jim, who nodded occasionally while a medic continued treating his head wound. Sarah was still clutching her radio, turning dials occasionally, as if hoping to pick up new information. "How bad is it out there?" I finally asked Sergeant Miller, who was checking his weapon near the front of the carrier. He glanced up, considering how much to tell us. "Bad," he admitted. "The broadcast affected about 60% of the population. Major cities are quarantine zones now. Military and emergency services were hit hard because many personnel were monitoring the emergency broadcast when it happened." "What was it?" Ruth asked. "Some kind of weapon?" Miller shook his head. "Above my pay grade, ma'am. All I know is what I've seen, and what I've seen is unlike anything in my 15 years of service. They're evolving," I said quietly. "Becoming more coordinated, learning to set traps." Miller's expression darkened. "Yeah, we've noticed. First 12 hours, they just attacked anything that made noise. Now they're hunting in groups, setting ambushes. Intelligence says they're developing some kind of communication system using those sounds they make." "How far has it spread?" Jim asked. "Nationwide, from what we've heard. Maybe global, but communications with overseas are spotty at best." The news hit us hard. Whatever hope we'd had that this was a localized incident evaporated. This wasn't just about surviving until help arrived anymore. Help itself was compromised. "What about a cure?" Sarah asked. "Is anyone working on reversing whatever the broadcast did?" Miller shrugged. "Scientists at the CDC were on it immediately, but a lot of them were affected too. From what I understand, they're focusing on protecting survivors rather than curing the infected. The working theory is that the sound frequency altered brain function somehow, but beyond that, I don't know." We fell silent again, absorbing this grim assessment. After a while, the carrier slowed and came to a stop. Miller stood up. "We're at the perimeter of Camp Harding. Everyone will need to go through medical screening before entering the secure zone. Standard procedure." The rear doors opened and bright afternoon sunlight flooded in. We blinked, adjusting to the light after the dim interior of the carrier. Outside was a scene of organized military efficiency. Concrete barriers formed a perimeter around what appeared to be a National Guard training facility. Soldiers manned watchtowers equipped with spotlights and mounted weapons. Beyond the immediate checkpoint area, I could see rows of tents and temporary structures. We were escorted to a screening area set up in what had once been a vehicle maintenance bay. Medical personnel in protective gear took blood samples and checked each of us for signs of infection or injury. They paid particular attention to our ears, examining them with specialized equipment. "What are they looking for?" I asked the doctor examining me. "Cochlear damage," she replied clinically. The broadcast affected the inner ear first, then spread to the brain. Those who survived without protection often have partial hearing loss or damage. We're trying to determine if there's a pattern that might help us understand the mechanism. After being cleared, we were given identification wristbands and assigned to temporary housing in the camp. Jim, Marcus, and I were placed in a tent with several other male survivors. Ruth, Ellie, and Sarah were taken to a women's section. "Rest up," the soldier who guided us told us. "Briefing for all new arrivals at 1800 hours in the main mess tent." The tent contained basic cots with sleeping bags, but after 2 days of constant fear and vigilance, they looked like luxury accommodations. I collapsed onto one, not intending to sleep but simply to rest for a moment. My body had other ideas, and I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost immediately. I woke to Marcus shaking my shoulder. "Sawyer, wake up, it's nearly 1800, briefing in 10 minutes. I sat up groggily, surprised to find I'd slept for several hours. Jim was already up, his head wound, now properly bandaged. He tossed me a bottle of water, which I drained gratefully. "How are you feeling?" I asked him. "Like I went 10 rounds with a bulldozer," he grimaced. "But I'll live. You look like you needed that sleep." I nodded, still trying to shake off the fog. "Any news while I was out?" Marcus and Jim exchanged a look. "Nothing official," Marcus said, "but rumors are flying. Some say the government knew what the broadcast would do. Others say it was a foreign attack. No one seems to know for sure." We made our way to the mess tent, a large structure at the center of the camp. It was crowded with survivors and military personnel. I spotted Ruth, Ellie, and Sarah sitting at a table near the front and joined them. "Sawyer," Ruth said with relief. "We were wondering where you were." "Caught up on some sleep," I admitted. "Any word on what this briefing is about?" Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice. "I overheard some soldiers talking. Apparently, they're going to discuss evacuation plans. Camp Harding wasn't designed as a long-term facility." Before we could discuss further, a tall officer in camouflage fatigue stepped onto a raised platform at the front of the tent. The room quieted immediately. "Good evening. I'm Colonel Davis, commander of this installation. I want to first welcome all new arrivals and assure you that you're safe here. Camp Harding is one of several secure facilities established in response to the current crisis." He paused, surveying the crowd. "I know you all have questions. I'll try to address the most pressing ones. First, what happened? At 0942 on September 17th, what appeared to be a routine emergency broadcast system test was transmitted nationwide. This broadcast contained an embedded acoustic pattern that affected neural function in most who heard it clearly. The origin of this broadcast is still under investigation." A murmur ran through the crowd. The colonel raised his hand for silence. "Second, what is the current situation? Approximately 60% of the U.S. population was directly affected, becoming what we're now officially designating as echo positives. Major urban centers are under quarantine. Essential services are being restored in secure zones like this one. Military and emergency response capabilities are at approximately 40% of normal levels." I glanced at my fellow survivors. The scale of the disaster was even worse than we'd feared. Third, what happens now? This facility was not designed for long-term occupation. Within the next 72 hours, we will begin evacuating civilians to permanent secure zones being established in less populated areas. These zones have been selected based on defensibility, resource availability, and distance from echo-positive concentrations. He gestured to a map behind him showing several locations marked in green. Most were in mountainous or remote areas. Finally, how can you help? We need people with specialized skills: medical personnel, engineers, security experience, construction, agriculture, communications, you name it. If you have skills that can help rebuild, please register them with the administration tent after this briefing. Colonel Davis continued with more details about camp protocols and immediate plans, but my mind was already racing ahead. My demolition expertise might not seem immediately useful in rebuilding society, but I understood structural integrity better than most. In a world where sound could mean death, knowing how to create silent, secure spaces would be invaluable. After the briefing, our group reconvened outside the mess tent. The evening air was cool, and the camp was bathed in the glow of floodlights. In the distance, I could hear the steady hum of generators and occasional vehicle movements. "What do you think?" Jim asked, his voice low. "They're moving us again." "Makes sense," I replied. "This place is too close to populated areas. Those permanent zones he mentioned are all in remote locations, harder for the infected to reach." Marcus looked troubled. Did anyone else notice he didn't mention a cure or treatment? It's all about containment and survival. "I noticed," Ruth said grimly. "They're writing off everyone who was affected, treating this as the new normal." "Maybe there isn't a cure," Ellie suggested, speaking up for the first time since the rescue. "Maybe whoever did this made sure of that." The implication hung heavy in the air. We'd all been thinking it but hadn't voiced it until now. This might not have been an accident or natural disaster. Someone might have deliberately unleashed this upon the world. "We should register our skills," Sarah said, changing the subject. "They'll need everyone contributing." We agreed and made our way to the administration tent. Inside, harried-looking staff were processing long lines of survivors. I joined a queue labeled Engineering and Construction. When I reached the front, a tired woman with a tablet computer asked for my information. "Name and previous occupation?" "Sawyer Holcomb, Structural Demolition Specialist for FEMA's Urban Search and Rescue Division." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Demolition? That's an unusual skill set for our current needs." "I understand structural integrity and how buildings respond to stress," I explained. "I know how sound travels through different materials and how to create secure spaces. In a world where noise attracts predators, that knowledge is valuable." She seemed to consider this, then nodded and made notes on her tablet. "Any other skills we should know about?" "I've worked in disaster zones for 20 years. I know how to improvise solutions with limited resources. I can assess buildings for safety, modify existing structures for defense, and create early warning systems that don't rely on traditional alarms." "Interesting," she murmured, typing rapidly. "We'll add you to the engineering assessment team for now. Report to the operations tent at 0700 tomorrow." I rejoined my group outside, finding they had all registered their skills as, well, Jim's security background had placed him with the perimeter defense team. Marcus's mechanical knowledge earned him a spot in vehicle maintenance. Ruth, with her library science background, was assigned to information management. Sarah's amateur radio experience put her in communications. Ellie, who had been studying nursing, was directed to the medical tent to assist. "Looks like we're all being put to work," Jim observed. "Better than sitting around waiting," I replied. "And it means they value what we bring to the table." As we talked, I noticed increased activity at the camp perimeter. Additional soldiers were taking positions along the walls, and spotlights were being directed outward into the darkness. "Something's happening," Marcus said, following my gaze. A soldier hurried past us toward the command center. I reached out and stopped him. "What's going on? Why the increased security?" He hesitated, then apparently decided we deserved to know. "Echo positives gathering outside the perimeter, more than we've seen before. They're not attacking, just watching. Command thinks they might be scouting our defenses." "How many?" Jim asked sharply. "At least 500, maybe more. They're staying just outside of effective weapons range." The soldier continued on his way, leaving us to process this disturbing information. "They followed us," Ellie whispered. "From Millridge." "Not necessarily," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "There are infected all over. This could be a coincidence." "You don't believe that," Ruth said quietly. "You've seen how they're changing, how they're learning." She was right. I didn't believe it was coincidence. The infected were evolving rapidly, developing cognitive abilities and social structures that seemed impossible given the short time frame. If they were now coordinating across larger distances, tracking survivor movements and gathering intelligence about secure zones, the implications were terrifying. We made our way to the perimeter, joining other survivors who had noticed the increased activity. From an observation platform, I could see what had the soldiers concerned. In the darkness beyond the camp, hundreds of pale figures stood in eerie stillness. They weren't making their typical distorted sounds. They weren't trying to break through. They were simply watching, heads tilted in that unnatural way that suggested they were listening. "Why aren't they attacking?" a woman nearby whispered. "There's so many of them." "They're learning," I replied grimly. "Testing our responses, gathering information." A soldier manning a spotlight swept the beam across the gathered infected. They didn't flinch or react to the light. Their clouded eyes remained fixed on the camp, their bodies unnaturally still except for an occasional head tilt or that jerky movement that characterized their kind. "I've never seen them so coordinated," Jim murmured. "It's almost like they have a hive mind now," Marcus added. I studied the infected, my demolition expert's mind automatically looking for patterns and weaknesses. Despite their increasing intelligence, they still had fundamental vulnerabilities. They relied heavily on sound for hunting and communication. They couldn't see well with those clouded eyes, and despite their resistance to pain, sufficient physical damage would still disable them. But their numbers and growing coordination made these weaknesses less significant. If they could coordinate across large groups, share information, and adapt their tactics, traditional defenses might not be enough. "We need to report what we've observed," I told the others. "Our experiences in Millridge might help the military understand what they're dealing with." We found a senior officer in the command center, a Major Wilson who was coordinating the perimeter defense. He listened intently as we described what we'd witnessed in Millridge, the transformation of the infected from mindless noise hunters to coordinated predators setting ambushes and communicating with each other. "This matches reports from other areas," he acknowledged when we finished. "The Echo positives are showing rapid adaptation and learning capabilities. Our scientists think it might be related to how the broadcast affected neural pathways. It didn't just damage the brain, it rewired it somehow." "So what's the plan?" Jim asked. "If they're getting smarter by the day, walls and guns won't hold them forever." Major Wilson's expression was grim. "That's why we're evacuating to more defensible locations. Higher elevations, natural barriers, better isolation, and we're working on more effective countermeasures." "What kind of countermeasures?" I pressed. He hesitated, then apparently decided we'd earned some trust. "Sound-based weapons, for one. If they're hypersensitive to certain frequencies, we can use that against them, and we're developing better silent transport and communication systems." "You need to think bigger," I said, an idea forming. "In Demolition, when you want to bring down a structure efficiently, you identify the critical support points. Hit those, and the whole thing collapses." "And what would be the critical support point for the infected?" Wilson asked, intrigued. "Their communication system," I replied. "Those sounds they make aren't just noise. They're transferring information, coordinating. If we could disrupt that, or better yet, feed false information into their network, we could create confusion and break their coordination." Wilson considered this. "An interesting theory. I'll pass it to our research team." He checked his watch. "You should all get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day preparing for evacuation." As we left the command center, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important about the infected. Their rapid evolution suggested an intelligence guiding them, a purpose beyond simple predation. The way they had gathered around the camp, watching, waiting, it reminded me of something, but I couldn't quite place it. That night, I dreamed of buildings collapsing, of support structures giving way one by one until nothing remained standing. I woke before dawn, the memory of clouded eyes and distorted sounds fresh in my mind. I stepped outside the tent, breathing in the cool morning air. The camp was already stirring, soldiers and survivors preparing for the day ahead. In the distance, I could see the perimeter watches being changed, spotlights still scanning the darkness beyond. Jim emerged from the tent looking as if he'd slept as poorly as I had. "They're still out there," he said without preamble. "I checked with the night watch. The infected haven't dispersed. If anything, more have gathered." "They're planning something," I replied. "I can feel it." "Like what? A direct assault?" I shook my head. "I'm not sure. But in Demolition we have a saying. When a structure changes its behavior, something critical has shifted. These infected are changing too quickly, becoming too organized. There has to be a reason." Over the next hours, as the camp prepared for evacuation, I couldn't shake my unease. I reported to the operations tent as assigned and spent the morning assessing buildings within the camp for structural integrity. The plan was to evacuate all civilians within 2 days, with military personnel following in stages. During a break, I found Marcus working on a transport vehicle nearby. "How's it going?" I asked. He wiped grease from his hands. "Good and bad. I've got 3 vehicles running silently enough not to attract attention, but fuel is becoming an issue. They're talking about converting some to alternative energy electric motors salvaged from civilian vehicles." "Smart," I nodded. "Electric would be quieter anyway." That's what I said. "But it takes time we might not have." He looked toward the perimeter. "They're still out there, you know, watching." "I know. Throughout the day I kept returning to the perimeter whenever I could, observing the infected gathering beyond. Their numbers had indeed grown since the previous night. There had to be nearly 1,000 now, standing in that unnatural stillness, occasionally making those distorted sounds to each other. By evening, the camp was on high alert. The evacuation schedule had been accelerated, with the first convoy of civilians set to depart at dawn. Our group was assigned to the second convoy, scheduled to leave 6 hours later. We gathered for dinner, in the mess tent, the mood tense but determined. Ruth had spent the day organizing critical information for transport. Sarah had helped establish communication protocols for the journey. Ellie had been assisting with medical preparations for vulnerable evacuees. "Something feels wrong about all this," I said as we ate. "The infected are too coordinated, too focused on this camp. It's like they're watching us prepare to leave." "You think they know about the evacuation?" Jim asked. "I think they're learning faster than we're giving them credit for," I replied. "And I'm worried they might be developing countermeasures of their own." As if to punctuate my concern, alarms suddenly blared throughout the camp. Soldiers rushed toward the perimeter, weapons ready. We followed the crowd outside to see what was happening. The scene at the perimeter was chaos. The infected had begun moving, not in their usual jerky manner, but with deliberate coordination. They were approaching the barriers in formation, some carrying objects I couldn't immediately identify. "Are those weapons?" Marcus asked in disbelief. It was worse than that. As they drew closer, I could see that some infected were carrying makeshift battering rams constructed from vehicle parts and building materials. Others had crude shields made from car doors and metal sheets. They were adapting using tools, preparing for an organized assault. "This isn't possible," a soldier nearby muttered. "They're not supposed to be capable of this." But they were. As we watched in horror, the infected began their attack. They moved in waves, those with shields advancing first to absorb the initial defensive fire. Behind them came others with the battering rams, aiming for the weakest points in the perimeter barrier. "They know exactly what they're doing," I whispered. "They've been watching us, learning our weaknesses." The defense forces responded with disciplined fire, taking down the front ranks of infected. But for each one that fell, more took its place. They were sacrificing themselves strategically, something that should have been beyond their cognitive capabilities. Colonel Davis appeared, shouting orders. "Accelerate the evacuation. First convoy moves out immediately. All non-essential personnel, prepare for immediate departure." In the chaos that followed, our group was separated. I found myself helping load civilians onto transport vehicles, using my knowledge of weight distribution to maximize capacity without compromising stability. All around me, the sounds of battle continued as the infected pressed their assault on the perimeter. Hours passed in a blur of activity. The first convoy departed under heavy escort, creeping through a temporarily cleared section of the perimeter. The infected seemed to anticipate this, redirecting their assault to focus on the evacuation route, but concentrated defensive fire kept them at bay long enough for the vehicles to break through. By dawn, the camp was half empty, with only essential personnel and those scheduled for the second convoy remaining. The perimeter had held, but at a cost. Dozens of soldiers had been injured or killed, and sections of the barrier had been compromised and hastily repaired. I finally reunited with my group at the loading area for the second convoy. They looked exhausted but unharmed. "Everyone okay?" I asked. They nodded, too tired for words. Around us, the remaining evacuees were boarding vehicles under the watchful eyes of nervous soldiers. The infected had pulled back after their initial assault, regrouping just beyond effective weapons range, but no one doubted they would attack again. "Our turn soon," Jim said, nodding toward the line of vehicles being prepared. I looked at the convoy, then back at the gathered, infected in the distance. Something still felt wrong. Their attack had been coordinated, intelligent, but also carefully timed. They had struck just as evacuations were beginning, almost as if they knew, I said suddenly. They knew about the evacuation. They've been listening to us somehow. "That's impossible," Marcus objected. "They can't understand complex language anymore." Not language, I realized, but they can interpret patterns, increased activity, vehicle movements, guard, rotations. I turned to Jim. "Remember in Millridge how they set up that ambush near the military perimeter? They weren't just reacting, they were anticipating." Before Jim could respond, a soldier approached us. "You're with the second convoy, right? We're loading now. Final checks are complete." We gathered our few possessions and moved toward the designated vehicle. Around us, the remaining camp personnel were in various stages of preparation for the final evacuation. Equipment was being packed, non-essential structures dismantled, and security measures reinforced for the skeleton crew that would remain until the last convoy. As we boarded our transport, a modified civilian bus with reinforced windows and armor plating, I took one last look at Camp Harding. For all its temporary nature, it had represented safety after the nightmare of Millridge. Now we were moving again, hoping the next secure zone would offer more permanent protection. But as the convoy started up and began moving toward the perimeter, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were entering a new phase of this silent war. The infected were no longer just mindless predators. They were becoming something else, something organized and purposeful. Understanding them, anticipating their evolution might be the key to humanity's survival. The bus passed through the reinforced gate and onto the road beyond. Behind us, Camp Harding grew smaller in the distance. Ahead lay an uncertain future in a world transformed by a single broadcast signal. I looked at my fellow survivors. People who had been strangers just days ago but were now bound together by shared experience and the will to live. Whatever came next, we would face it together, adapting just as our silent enemies were adapting, finding new ways to survive in a world gone quiet. As a demolition expert, I had spent my career bringing structures down safely. Now I would need to use that knowledge to help build something new, a future in which humanity could survive against an enemy that grew more intelligent with each passing day. It would require all our skills, all our courage, and a willingness to understand our enemy even as we fought against it. The silence of the road ahead was broken only by the quiet hum of our vehicle's engine, carefully muffled to avoid detection. In that silence lay both danger and opportunity, a new world waiting to be navigated by those who had survived the first 48 hours of humanity's greatest challenge.